Welcome to FW 4250, the Wolves and Moose of Isle Royale. My name is John Vucetich, and I'll be the instructor for this course. And this is the first in a series of lectures for this class, and we'll get into things straight away. And so first of all, just some real basics. Where is Isle Royale? So Isle Royale is located in Lake Superior, which is indicated right here. It's the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. And in that lake is Isle Royale, which is a federally designated wilderness and a national park. And what's important about this island is that it's inhabited by a population of wolves and moose. And those wolves and moose have been studied for the last, well, now more than 50 years. And what we've mostly been studying about them is their interactions as predator and prey. And in so much as they interact as predator and prey, what we'll be able to do is throughout the course of this class is to study and think about the wolves and moose of Isle Royale, both in terms of predation and trophic cascades. We'll look at the population ecology of these populations, foraging behavior, life history theory as it applies to both wolves and moose, conservation genetics, and other topics as well. So basically what we'll do is we'll take the wolves and moose of Isle Royale and we'll use it as a framework for kind of covering a wide range of topics in ecology. In addition to covering these kind of traditional scientific topics, what we'll also do is pay a little bit of attention to the relationship between scientific knowledge and environmental ethics. These are topics that are usually kept quite separate. They usually pretend like they don't interact or affect one another in the least. What you may or may not know about the Isle Royale Wolf Moose Project is that it has a long history of kind of appreciating the connections between science and ethics to understand that they're in fact connected, not separate. And to kind of help us wrap our minds around these connections, one of the things that this class will feature are a series of guest lectures that will come from Professor Michael Nelson from Michigan State University. We'll see a little bit more of him, quite a bit more of him later in the semester, and he'll be helping us make some of these connections as they relate to the Wolf and Moose Project. So in any event, what I want to do right now is just talk just very briefly about the class structure. An important web page for understanding how the class is organized and outlined is indicated right here on this slide. And then the other basic formats of the class is that there'll be weekly lectures that will be posted on the internet. I'll give you more details about how to find those postings soon, or maybe you already have them. In addition to these pre-recorded lecture materials, there'll also be weekly discussions. They'll be formatted basically like a live web conference type scenario. If you don't have the details on how to do that technology, we'll cover that very shortly. And then the other kind of main detail is just as far as grades go, grading will be based on a midterm and a final exam. The details of that are on the web page that's listed here on the slide. And so with some of those real basic issues kind of set aside, just where Isle Royale is and what the basic topics of the class will be, now we can get into business and start talking about the wolves and moose of Isle Royale. And what I want to do first is I want to just spend a little bit of time thinking about wolves and moose individually. We'll think about moose first, and we just want to cover some basics of their natural history. What is the life of a moose all about? And before we get into discussing some of the basic aspects of the natural history of moose, it's probably useful to ask ourselves some questions about why would we even care about what the life of a moose is all about. And what I'd like to do is just plant a few questions in your mind to have there as we're discussing this information, and we'll return to these questions after talking a little bit about wolves and moose. And so why should we care about moose? Is it maybe because they represent important insights about mammals in general? Moose are a very well-studied species. We know a great deal about them. Should we care about moose because they are important components of ecosystems, and that's the reason to know about them? it turns out that for the most part, wherever you find moose, we also find there are people who have for a long time appreciated hunting moose for a variety of reasons. Is that the reason that we should care about them, to kind of understand that relationship better? So just hold those questions in your mind, in the back of your head, and think of other reasons why we would care about moose, and we'll return to them in a little bit. And for now, let's start thinking about moose. And what I want to do is go through the course of a year in the life of a moose. And what I want to do is start in the springtime. The thing to know about moose is that they're, in the springtime, they're just getting over the winter. And the winter is a difficult time for moose. They're at their lowest body weight by the end of winter and the beginning of spring. And in the springtime, when the vegetation starts to grow forth, they're interested to eat as much of that vegetation as possible so that they can increase their body weight throughout the course of the summer and get ready for the next winter. Now, here's the thing of it. Moose will increase their body weight by about 25% over the course of about 4 months of the summertime. And so that would be like, if you weigh about 150 pounds, that would be like putting on about 37 pounds of weight in the course of about 4 months. But here's the thing. Imagine putting on all that weight if you were a complete vegetarian. Now, again, it's not like you get to have croutons and ranch dressing on the salad. No, it's imagine eating only lettuce and gaining 35, 37 pounds. It would be very difficult to do. How would you do it? You would do it by eating an enormous amount, and moose do. In the summertime, moose eat every day about 40 pounds of vegetation. They spend about 8 hours of every day just actively chewing and taking in food. And what's more of it than just spending about 8 hours of every day actively biting and chewing and swallowing their food is that the food that they eat, it's got kind of a large volume, it's relatively low in nutrition, and so it's a bit difficult to digest. And so as a result, moose have one of the most complicated digestive systems that's known to science. It's a digestive system that's known as rumination. It's the same kind of digestive system that cows have. And basically what's entailed is this, is that moose take in their food, they chew it, they swallow it, it goes into their rumen, and in the rumen some microbes work on it a little bit, digest it partially, and then they regurgitate, the moose regurgitates that food, and they chew it again. Here's the important part. Moose spend about 8 hours of every day chewing their cud, chewing that partially digested food. So 8 hours a day the first time they chew the food, and then 8 hours a day the second time they chew it all. That's 16 hours of every day spent chewing their food. If you want to know what it's like to be a moose, just chew your food, and when you're done, keep on chewing it and chewing it and chewing it. Moose take many thousands of chews per day in order to satisfy their requirements for nutrition. Now, another thing to think about moose we can think about moose in the summertime. What I'd like to do right now, there's a couple of different kinds of moose. One of the types of moose to think about are the bulls, or the male moose. And what's distinctive about bulls in the summertime is that they grow their antlers, and their antlers begin growing in late April. And when they begin growing, they just start off as these little nubs. They're grown new every single year, and at the end of fall, basically, early winter, they drop those antlers. So it's something they do over and over again every single year. When those antlers are growing at their fastest rate, they can grow as much as 1/4 of an inch in a single day along the top margin of the antlers. It turns out it takes about 25% of all of the energy that moose has available to it in the summertime, 25% of its energy, to grow those antlers. It's an enormous energy expense. All right? Well, energy that goes into growing those antlers, that's energy that they don't put into increasing their body weight. Increasing their body weight so they can survive the upcoming winter. So growing antlers represents trading off chances to survive the winter. Well, what could be so important about those antlers that it would be worth all of that energy expenditure and investment? Well, first of all, just a little detail about the antlers. When the antlers are full grown, that's in about late October, they look something like this. And basically what the purpose of these antlers is all about is, it's about, in one word, it's about sex. It's about being successful in terms of reproduction. And the antlers are used in a couple of different ways. Males use the antlers in these ways. When two males come together in the fall time, what they do is they try to figure out who's got the biggest antlers. And whoever has the biggest antlers, that moose gets to stay in that area, and the moose with the smaller antlers has to leave the area. And as a result, the moose that stays, the one with the bigger antlers, he has access to more females, to the females in that area. And so this is the way in which the males use these antlers for competition. Now, sometimes we get the impression, maybe from watching like wildlife programs on TV and stuff like that, that this competition with the antlers is some very dramatic and violent affair. It's really not. It's a pretty laid back sort of a situation. What happens is basically this: when these two moose come together, what they do is they drop their heads, and then they just kind of wave their heads back and forth, and they have their antlers there, and then the two moose can pretty easily see who's got the bigger antlers. And after just a little bit of that, the one with the smaller antlers just leaves. Now, occasionally, if these two moose have what seem to be similar sized antlers and neither one of them wants to concede, at the most what they'll do is they'll come into very gentle contact with one another, antlers against antlers, and then they have basically a bit of a pushing contest. But it's really quite a delicate affair. Again, think about these antlers that we see on the screen here. The tines across the top, they're pretty pointy, and they're backed up by 1,000 pounds of moose, and they're pretty dangerous things. And neither moose is interested to injure itself with respect to these antlers. Occasionally, what happens is that when they push against one another, their antlers get locked together accidentally, and then what happens is that these moose die. So no moose wants to die over this. They just want to have access to some territory. Now, the antlers are used in more than just this way between the males. Antlers are also used by females. Females do not grow antlers, but they, of course, can see them in the males. And here's basically what a female does. For females, getting pregnant and raising a calf is a huge energy expenditure, and she does not want to waste that reproductive effort on a male mate who's not really worth anything or not adequately fit. And so what happens is that these antlers are taken as a sign, and the sign that's delivered is basically this: as a male moose, hey, I'm in such marvelous shape, I'm in such great shape that I can afford to waste an enormous amount of energy on these antlers. And so what happens is it's this extravagant kind of sex symbol is basically what it is. It's really no different than when, say, a guy spends too much money on a sports car, or when a peacock spends an enormous amount of energy growing these very fancy plumes to attract a female mate. We see this over and over again in the animal world, where it's often the male of the species that spends a lot of energy just basically showing off as a sign, an honest indicator that they're in good shape. And so another type of moose to think about in the summertime would be calves. Calves are born in the last week of May. And when they're born, they weigh about 35 pounds. This is an image of a calf that's just a couple of days old. These calves grow really quite rapidly, and one of the ways in which they're able to grow so rapidly is from the nourishment of their mother's milk. A cow moose may produce up to 100 gallons of milk throughout the course of the summer. It turns out that all of the time that the bull moose is growing those antlers and all of the energy that goes into growing those antlers, the cow spends about the same amount of energy during that last month of pregnancy, which is when the bulls begin growing their antlers, and then throughout the summer producing the milk for that calf. So the cows and the bulls, they spend similar amounts of energy on reproduction. They just do it in really different ways. And the other really important distinction between the bulls and the cows is that the bulls have to grow their antlers every single year. The cows very frequently will only successfully raise a calf all the way to the end of the first summer, about once every other year. In some cases, the cow may abort, the cow may give birth to the calf, but then it dies within a few days, and in the process of that death of the calf, the cow doesn't have to spend all that energy raising it. And so one of the things is that because the cows take a break frequently every other year, bulls are growing these antlers every year. One of the things that happens is that the year after year toll of growing these antlers it just wears the bulls out, and as a result, bull moose die on average about 1 year earlier in their lives than do the cows, and it's basically they die from growing their antlers. This is what kills them. Now, moose have this really remarkable relationship with the water. Moose are members of the deer family. They're cervids, same group of species to which white-tailed deer, mule deer, and elk belong to. And of all of the members of the deer family, it's moose that are most associated with water. So much so, you might even call them, if you like, the boreal hippopotamus. Boreal, just a word referring to north. And then, of course, the hippopotamus is a kind of animal that spends a lot of time in the water. There are 3 important reasons that moose spend so much time in the water. One of the reasons that they do so is for aquatic vegetation. Aquatic vegetation has a higher concentration of sodium, and with that higher concentration of sodium, it's a good food source for these moose, and so that's one of the reasons that they spend time there. A moose is so well adapted to foraging in the water that they can do something that no human can do, and it's this. We all know, of course, that moose have these very, very large noses. In having such a large nose, one of the things that they have are sphincters, a special type of muscle, whereby they can constrict the nostrils without having to do anything. They just clench, and then these nostrils are closed. This allows them to put their face in the water and to take food in without having to blow bubbles or without having the risk of sucking up water into their nose and this sort of a thing. And if you don't think that that's an accomplishment, to be able to close your nostrils without touching them with your fingers, just give it a try. It's nothing that you can do, of course. It's a special adaptation for sure. Now, I mentioned that one of the reasons that moose spend time in the water is for sodium. We'll come back to water in a minute, but I want to spend a little time talking about sodium as it relates to moose. Sodium, we'll explain the picture that we have here in just a moment. Sodium is something that makes up just a very, very tiny portion of the body of any animal. We can think for a moment just about mammals. It's less than 1/10% of our body weight is made up of sodium. It's a very small part, but it's very, very important. It's critical for the proper functioning of our nerves, for proper functioning of our muscles, for proper blood balance. All of these things require sodium. Sodium is not something that our body can manufacture. We have to eat it. Okay. If you eat meat, you get most of the sodium that you need through eating the flesh of other animals who have gathered that sodium on our behalf. If you're a complete herbivore, you have to get sodium from a plant. Well, the sodium concentration in a plant depends, importantly, on how much sodium there is in the soil. And that varies depending on the part of the world that you're in. In places like Isle Royale, sodium is relatively poor in the soil, which means it's relatively poor in the plants, which means that animals like moose living on Isle Royale, they have a difficult time finding sodium. And so what they do is they exhibit this really remarkable feature that has a special name. It's called geophagy. Geophagy literally means geo means the earth, and phagy just means the mode by which you eat. Geophagy just means to eat the earth. And so what moose do is they go and they find places where there are springs, spring water coming out of the earth, and in that spring water happens to be just rich concentrations of minerals, including sodium. And so what happens is when they find these areas, the moose will congregate there. Moose that are normally solitary animals will come to these places, and that's basically what we're looking at as a picture here. So this is looking at just a small portion of a mineral lick. Mineral lick could be as big as, say, 30 feet by 30 feet, so the size of a medium or large-sized house, the footprint that such a house would make. And what the moose will do is they will pad that place down so intensively that no vegetation will grow there, as shown in the picture. It's just a big muddy mess, and the moose will go and literally just suck up the mud. And while it seems like really, well, it is a remarkable behavior, it's a behavior that we find throughout the world and in a wide range of species. If you've ever seen maybe butterflies in the summertime all grouping together in some mud puddle, well, what they're doing is sucking the sodium. Butterflies do this, parrots do this, elephants do this. Humans exhibit geophagy. When we mine the earth for sodium, for salt, and then eat it, that's geophagy. It's common. In fact, also if you're familiar with white-tailed deer and putting out a salt block to attract them maybe during hunting season, it's all the same phenomena that's being spoken of. Anyways, it all speaks to the need for sodium and a very interesting behavior that moose exhibit on Isle Royale. And but if you remember, what I want to just return to is this topic of the moose's relationship with water. I mentioned one reason that they do this is to get these aquatic plants that have sodium in it. Another reason to spend time in the water is simply the protection from predators. If a moose is in water that is just ankle deep for it, it's going to be water that's halfway up the legs or all the way up to the chest of a wolf, and just that is enough to afford a little bit of extra protection for the moose. And so by moose spending time in the water, they get this protection from predators. Here's an example of you can imagine that if a wolf were to attack a moose like the one that we're looking at here, that wolf would be up to its chest in water and would not have much advantage at all. Now, another reason that moose spend time in the water is to stay cool. Moose are creatures of the North Country. Isle Royale is about as far south on the planet as you can go and still find moose. If you find them any further south, it's usually because they're in mountainous areas, like in, say, the Rocky Mountains, where it's higher country and cooler temperatures. Nevertheless, being creatures of the North Country, they don't like it when it gets hot. When it is warmer than about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, moose have to do something to kind of deal with the temperature. And part of the troubles that they have is they don't have sweat glands, so they don't have a way to perspire and get rid of moisture that way. Another thing that's a big deal about moose, or a problem for the moose, is that being ruminants, they have that very, very large rumen. That's a big fermentation vat, basically. And in that fermentation, what's being generated is heat. So it's hot outside, they're generating heat from the inside, and they just need good ways to stay cool. Here's the thing, if there's no water available, what a moose can do to stay cool is basically sit down in the shade. If they're sitting down in the shade, then they're not eating. And if they're not eating, then they're not getting ready for winter. And if they're not getting ready for winter, they might not survive it. And so by being in the water, they can simultaneously stay cool and feed at the same time. By being in the water, a moose can reduce its respiration rate by about 30% and can reduce its overall energy expenditure, energy spent trying to stay cool, by about 10%. And so these are some of the reasons why moose spend so much time in the water. Now what I want to do is shift and think about moose in the wintertime here. I mentioned that moose have this interesting relationship with temperature, and then we spoke about it in terms of summer. When we think about wild animals in the wintertime, I think one of the common thoughts we have is that, wow, it must be difficult to be a wild animal in the wintertime. To be so cold. Wow, what a difficult thing. Well, let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine what temperature it is when you get cool, when you get a little bit chilly. Imagine that you're lightly dressed. Imagine that you're not real active. You're in the shade. What temperature is it that you start to get cool? Well, it's probably the temperature at which you set your house. Maybe 64 degrees, 65 degrees, something like that. Maybe 62 degrees, somewhere in there, and then you start to get cold. Well, what happens when you get cold? The first thing that happens, you don't even notice. Your internal metabolism starts to rev up a little bit. You start to burn internal heat, basically, internal energy to make heat, and that's one way to stay warm. What happens next is that you get goosebumps. Goosebumps are a couple of things. It's more muscle action to help us keep warm a little bit, as it causes our hairs to become erect. But the other thing that happens is that our ancestors a long time ago would have had much more hair. That hair would be erect, and that would perform some insulation for us to have that hair standing up just a little bit. And then when we get even colder, then we start to shiver. It turns out that just about every mammal does all of those things when it gets cold. Moose are no exception. But here's the thing about moose. They don't even begin to elevate their metabolism, not even in a tiny little bit, until it's colder than about 25 degrees below zero. And so that means that on a place like Isle Royale, moose don't even experience cold except for maybe just a couple hours of the entire year. On Isle Royale, it doesn't get to 25 below zero except for a few hours of the coldest night of the year, and that's about it. So really think about this for a minute. A moose on Isle Royale is not actually all that familiar with the sensation of being cold in the way that we are. Now that doesn't mean that winter is an easy time. Winter is a difficult time, and it's difficult mainly because of food. Again, on Isle Royale, the moose that live there are a little bit smaller than moose living other places. So a cow moose might be about 900 pounds, a big bull moose 1,000 pounds. So imagine a 1,000-pound moose in the wintertime is reduced to eating just the twigs of a few different species of plants. We see twigs in this image here of some deciduous plants that moose can eat. And in this image here, we see moose eating the twig and the needles of balsam fir trees. It turns out that every bite that a moose takes in the wintertime is equal to a gram of food. It takes 27 grams to equal an ounce of food. Imagine being a 900 or 1,000-pound animal, and every bite you get is just a tiny fraction of an ounce of food. As a result, all of the energy that it takes to go around and get that food, it costs more energy than there is energy in the food. And as a result, every day for about 5 weeks, moose lose body weight. And that's just a normal part of their lives. Moose on Isle Royale, sometimes the situation for food is so bad that they'll eat lichens right off of the trees. Imagine eating lichens. If you've ever seen a lichen up close, if you were to grab a little bit of it and hold it, it would be like eating dust. There's nothing there. But this is what they eat. And so you can ask the question, well, if it takes more energy to get all of that food than there is energy in the food, well, why would they even do it? There's 2 reasons that moose would want to keep eating. One, they're both pretty noteworthy. One is that just taking in a little bit of food is an important way in order to keep the microbes within the gut of a moose alive. It's just feeding those microbes throughout the winter is a big, big part of it. The other thing that's a little bit hard to grasp immediately is that a twig, especially if it's a conifer that has needles on it, like a balsam fir tree, that's still 50% water, and eating twigs is an important source of water for moose in the wintertime. And so, nevertheless, while moose are losing weight every single day through the winter, because of this poor food situation, one of the things they do is they do spend less time feeding, and they spend more time just resting. And this is a fine time to just kind of ask, what is a moose doing in a situation like this? What is their life really about? They're not cold, that's for sure. In the wintertime, they're hungry, but they're hungry in a way that would be very difficult for us to understand. All summer long, they stuff themselves with these really remarkable, one fresh salad after the next. It would be like if a person ate like 7 pounds of fresh salad every day. That's equivalent to what they do. And then every day for the winter, you don't get enough food, and you lose weight every single day. While it's a certain kind of hunger for sure, it's something that's just a normal part of their everyday life. And then it's perfectly appropriate to ask, well, what do they do for hour after hour while they're just sitting there? Are they bored? Well, I have no idea what happens between the ears of a moose that way, but it's certainly a fair enough question to ask. One thing they are doing is they're really quite alert throughout all of this time while they're just sitting there. Their ears are really quite active and kind of moving around all of the time quite actively, basically listening for predators, listening for wolves. So anyways, wintertime presents another difficulty for moose, and the difficulty is associated with a tick species. And this really is quite an incredible species of tick. The first thing that's interesting about this tick is that it's a specialist. It's really interested just in the blood of cervids, blood that belongs to members of the deer family, and on Isle Royale that would be moose. It turns out that's the normal situation, it's just that we're not familiar with it. Across the world there are something like 400 species of ticks, and most species of ticks are specialists in that way. It's just that the ticks that we're familiar with, like dog ticks and deer ticks, they're pretty comfortable eating the blood of kind of basically any vertebrate. Anyways, this tick specializes, on Isle Royale anyways, on moose. Not interested in snowshoe hares, not interested in wolves, not interested in people. Just the moose. The other thing that's important about this tick is when it's active. It's active in the wintertime. We normally think of invertebrates as being active in the summertime. The life cycle of this tick, in a nutshell, is basically this. They exist in the summertime only in the form of eggs, and the eggs are in the soil. And what happens at the end of the summer, beginning of fall, like around October, Those eggs hatch, and then they crawl to the tops of the grasses that are around, and then they wait for a moose to walk along. And when a moose walks along, they latch onto the side of the moose, and then they stay with the moose all winter. They feed, and then they go through several life stages, each time a little bigger than the previous time. And for each life stage, they feed again, taking another blood meal. The males and the female ticks, they reproduce on the moose. The male ticks die while they're on the moose. Females in the springtime, late winter, early spring, they drop off of the moose while they have their eggs, and then lay their eggs in the soil, and the cycle starts all over again. Okay, so the ticks are specialists. They're unusual for being active in the winter time. The other thing that's remarkable is that one moose can have well in excess of 50,000 ticks on it if it's a heavily infested moose. Now, moose have black skin, and so what we're looking at here, especially in the shoulder area, is basically bare naked moose. The ticks were so intense on this particular moose. This is an image taken in the springtime. Early springtime, when the damage that the ticks do is the most intense on these moose. A couple of things happen. One is the moose gets irritated, so they bite at their own skin, and as a result tear the hair away. They rub against the sides of trees, and all of this causes their hairs to break away. Other things that we see in this picture is that this area right here that looks kind of blonde in color, those are broken and damaged hairs, and the only hair that's in reasonable shape right here are these brown areas on the belly, a little bit right here on the cheek, and then some on the legs as well. And so anyways, these ticks are having their greatest impact at the end of winter and the early spring. This is when life is already very difficult for a moose. The last month that the moose have these ticks, if it's a heavily infested moose, something like 70,000 ticks say, the moose may have to just about replace its entire blood supply once in about a 5-week period to keep up with what the ticks are taking. And that toll can lead to the death of a moose. And it turns out that on Isle Royale, when moose die, they die basically of one of two causes. They die either of being killed by wolves, we'll talk about that in just a little bit, or they die of what's basically starvation that follows at the end of the winter. And that starvation the chances of starving can be exacerbated quite a bit by outbreaks of ticks, which happen from time to time. Something we'll focus on quite a bit more in later parts of this class. So anyways, that's in a nutshell a little bit about the life of a moose. And now what I want to do is shift and think just a little bit about the nature of wolves. Now as we shift our attention and focus on the lives of wolves a little bit, what I want to do is just point out for a minute that what we mostly know about wolves, in the kind of our common conception of them, lies in our imaginations. We know wolves primarily, and especially through our mythologies, our folk tales, our religious traditions. Wolves are these really prominent symbols of things that are both good and bad, positive and negative. We know the Little Red Riding Hood type stories, but there are also things like, in the West even, the Western civilization was founded by Romulus and Remus, who were suckled from a wolf. And so we mythologize and symbolize wolves in a great deal. This is a natural thing for humans to do. It's unavoidable, I think, for us to do this to animals. In the case of wolves, though, it's turned out to be pretty unfair, and it's caused us to hate wolves for more than we could ever possibly have reason to do so, and it's been destructive for them. And what's especially disappointing about this is that of all of the creatures, wolves, in some important ways, are not that difficult for us to know and understand. There's a couple of things about wolves that we can relate to pretty easily. One is that wolves are these marvelous walkers. And a wolf can walk at a comfortable clip at about 6 miles an hour. And they can do that for about 8 hours a day. They don't necessarily do that every day, but it would be easy for them to do so. To walk 30 miles in a day for a wolf would be nothing. Think for just a minute about a location that's 30 miles away from where you live. Imagine that for just a minute. Imagine where you live. Imagine something that's 30 miles from where you live. If you're driving on the highway, it would take you about 30 minutes to get there, say. And then imagine walking there. That's what a wolf can do every single day. They're these marvelous walkers. And they walk for a couple of different reasons. One of the reasons that they walk is to capture their food. On Isle Royale, the food is moose, and these moose are rather thinly distributed across the landscape and kind of hidden by the forest, and so wolves have to walk around and find these animals, these moose. And so in this image right here, there's the moose right here being chased by a number of wolves. We can see them all throughout the image right there and there. And so really, without a doubt, the most remarkable part of the relationship between wolves and moose is the actual predation event itself. And what I want to do is describe a little bit about how it is that wolves kill moose and how it is that moose escape being eaten by wolves and this sort of a thing. Now, the first thing to understand about wolves and moose is that it is the moose, a middle-aged, healthy moose, that are the kings and queens of the forest, not wolves. A healthy middle-aged moose has relatively little to fear from wolves, especially if there are other moose out there, calves, older moose that aren't doing as well. And so what happens is that when wolves find a moose, that's only half of the task. The other half of the task is to figure out if it's one that they're actually able to kill. And that figuring out if wolves are able to kill this moose that they may have just found involves a little bit of a testing. Basically what happens is this, is that when wolves find a moose, the thing they do is that they run right up to it, charge it, one or two of the wolves, and when they get within just a few yards or meters away from the moose, they put the brakes on right at the last minute, and then they stop, maybe retreat just a step or two, and see what the moose does. If the moose just stands there, well, then the wolves will have retreated, and they might try it one more time. They might run right up and then put the brakes on right at the last minute and then wait to see what the reaction of the moose is. If the moose stands there again, the wolves usually just walk away. And that's the end. The moose standing there is a sign that there's really, that moose is in good shape. It's got really pretty little to fear. And then the wolves just, they walk away. It takes about as long for that interaction to play out as it took for me to describe it. And 19 out of 20 times that wolves find a moose, that's how it ends out. Imagine, every time you went to the McDonald's drive-thru, 19 out of 20 times they just said, we're not gonna serve you today. Just finding the food is not it. They have to find it and then determine it's one that they can capture. However, 1 out of 20 times when wolves find a moose, it's one that's got something wrong with it. Maybe it's a calf that's not especially well defended by its mother. Maybe it's an older moose that's injured in some way, malnourished, something like this. And then when approached by the wolves, the moose, presumably out of a sensation of fear, turns around and runs. And then what happens is that the wolves follow. And now we can kind of pick up on the action with this slide here. The thing to bear in mind is that wolves generally don't weigh as much as we do. On Isle Royale, wolves are only 75, 80 pounds or so. And that moose, again on Isle Royale, maybe 900, 1,000 pounds if it's a big bull. Moose are 10 times the size of a wolf, and they're going to kill it with their teeth. Think about it for a minute. That should strike you as incredibly dangerous. Yeah, sure, they have really well-adapted teeth. Their teeth are very different than ours. Nevertheless, this animal weighs 10 times the size of any single one of those wolves, and they're going to kill it with their teeth. And the basic strategy, as they're chasing this moose, is for one of the wolves, usually it's an alpha wolf, one of the leaders of the pack, they grab onto the moose with its teeth, on the hind end usually, and then they are taken really for quite a ride. Now the thing to understand is that, every time that this moose is leaping and bounding, the wolf is going to be kicked in the belly by the legs of the moose. The wolf is going to be dragged over logs and stumps and this sort of thing. It's pretty dangerous business. Nevertheless, what happens is that it makes the moose slow down just a little bit. That gives a chance for maybe one or two other wolves to kind of do the same thing, to catch up to the moose, grab onto it, slows the moose down even more. And what the wolves are after is just so that the moose is not making any forward motion. If things get to this stage, like what we see in this picture here, where the moose is stopped, the wolves have made physical contact, the fate of the moose is almost for sure sealed, and it will end in death. But still, it's a dangerous, dangerous animal, the moose is. And the wolves are at risk of some serious injuries. And so, for example, you can see here, this wolf right here, all that has to happen is for that moose to swing its rear end around. The wolf will not let go. They have these very powerful jaws. The wolf will keep hanging on. But the rest of the wolf will become airborne and smack right into the side of this tree here and break several of its ribs. Now we know from places like in Alaska, where it's legal to trap wolves and then people inspect their carcasses, there's hardly a wolf that's lived for more than a couple years that hasn't had several of its ribs broken and rehealed. The business of capturing food for a wolf causes serious injury. Wolves can sometimes die from these injuries. We can see a few other things happening in this picture here. We can see this wolf right here. This is one of the alpha wolves of the pack. What he's trying to do, it's the alpha male. It turns out this is the alpha female of this pack. What that wolf is trying to do, this one right here, is looking for an opportunity to grab onto the nose of that moose. Why would it do that? Think of like a bull ring, those big old rings that are sometimes put on the noses of a bull. Here's the thing: when you have the nose of a deer or a member of the deer family, you have quite a bit of control over it. And so if you can have the rear end and the nose grabbed, it's much, much easier to bring that animal to the ground. Notice these other wolves. What's going on here? This wolf right here. What's going on there? Nothing. It turns out that the large portion of the work done in killing a moose is mostly done by the leaders of the pack, the alpha male and the alpha female. Sometimes one or two other wolves are participating pretty actively, but most wolves in a pack, we'll talk about this more later, are just pups, and they're just basically waiting for a meal. Back to a little bit of some of the action. Sometimes what happens is that the wolves are able to stop the moose from making forward motion, but then they still don't quite have things under control. And then the great danger to the wolves is this business of possibly getting kicked. And those hooves are, as you can imagine, pretty powerful, quite sharp. And what we can see right here is a situation where a wolf is just in the motion of being kicked and hurled into the air. Anyways, this goes on, this attacking and waiting and holding, trying to kill this moose. Eventually what happens, and it's a combination of absolute sheer persistence on behalf of the wolves and just complete exhaustion on behalf of the moose, is that the moose eventually collapses to the ground. And then the wolves start feeding. Now, the time it takes from when wolves first make physical contact with a moose to this point that we see here in the image, that can be as brief as 20 minutes, and the longest that I've seen anyways has been 9 days. And in these very long circumstances, what happens basically is that the wolves will make an attack, wound the moose just a bit maybe, but then they realize the moose is still in pretty strong shape, and so they just lay down nearby, maybe 30, 40 yards away, and they just sleep all day long. And when the moose tries to lay down, or when the moose tries to walk away, they go and attack it one more time. Keep it standing up. Keep it awake all the time, 24/7, day after day, and then eventually the animal dies. Now, it's a fine and fair question to ask. What does a moose actually die of? Under this situation. Basically what it dies of is shock. It dies of a loss of blood pressure to the brain. And there's a couple of ways to kind of see all of this. The first thing to realize is that wolves are feeding on this moose before it's dead. It dies shortly after they start feeding on it. And if you take it from the moose's perspective, I mean, there's no doubt what an absolutely horrific way to have to die. There's just no doubt about it. It's hard to think of a worse way that an organism could die. On the other hand, think of the moose's alternative. The moose's alternative to death in a place like Isle Royale is starvation. And this starvation business would be this long drawn-out procedure that would last many, many weeks. It would all end in one day the animal doesn't have enough strength to get up, lays down, never gets up again. Now, we've studied both kinds of death, it turns out, in humans. It turns out starvation is a pretty painful way to die. It's a very uncomfortable situation. And it turns out that we know that, sadly enough, studying humans in warfare, that death associated with shock, massive blood loss, loss of blood pressure to the brain, this sort of thing, is not so painful. Our senses are numbed in that way. And so again, I don't know if these are any consolations, and besides, there's no one in the room, no one in the audience here who's in a good position to say, well, what's the better way to die? And so you have these two ways to die. One is absolutely horrific, to be killed and eaten by wolves, to have to starve to death. And then you have the wolves' perspective, which is what an incredibly brave and dangerous way to have to capture your food that can kill you. What a remarkable thing. And after you take it all in and think about it for a little bit, you're just left with this sense of, wow, what an incredible planet that we live on. What an amazing place where it is that life and death proceeds in this way. In this, anyways, this business of predation is one of the most common ecological relationships on the planet. It occurs between many, many types of species in these really grand ways, like between wolves and moose, and in ways that almost always escape our attention but are no less dramatic between things like robins and worms. It's the same really remarkable ecological process. I'd mentioned a few moments ago, anyways, this business that the other way that a moose can die is through starvation, and so that's what this image is meant to remind us of. Anyways, what I want to think about for a minute is just now imagine that you're a wolf, you're living in a pack, and you've just killed a moose. You've created a meal that's 10 times the size of any one of the animals in that pack. When you kill something that big, you're going to attract scavengers. And these scavengers can be kind of a big deal. In this picture, the main scavengers are the ravens, and they may not seem like very much. There's 4 of them right here, and another couple over here, one sneaking a bite of food in right there. In this situation, there'd be a number of ravens outside the frame of this image in the trees. 15, 20 ravens is pretty common to be on a wolf kill. One raven can take up to 4 pounds of food a day, 2 kilograms. They don't eat it all. They eat some of it, and then they hide the rest in trees and save it for later, let it freeze, and then eat it at a later time. Ravens alone, do the arithmetic, 4 pounds a day times 15 ravens times 7 days, say. Ravens by themselves could eat most of a carcass. That's just the ravens. On Isle Royale, there are also eagles, there are foxes. If you go other places on the mainland or out west where there are wolves, there are grizzly bears in the summertime, mountain lions, a lot of different types of scavengers, coyotes. Wolves have 2 pretty remarkable adaptations to help them eat their food fast, to help them eat their food faster than the scavengers do. One of their adaptations is that they live in packs. There's been a long-standing kind of a question, why is it that wolves live in packs? What are the advantages? We'll spend a better part of a lecture talking just about that topic. But here's one idea that we'll, like I said, we'll cover in more detail later. By living in a pack of related members, brothers and sisters, parents and offspring, the wolves, indeed, they have to share the food among themselves, but it turns out that's not quite so much sharing as they would have to share as if there was just 1 or 2 wolves and then they lost all the rest of the ravens and foxes and this sort of thing. And so group living is one of the adaptations that wolves have for consuming their food before scavengers get it. The other adaptation that wolves have, and we need to remind ourselves how big a wolf is, 85-pound wolf. We have that in mind for a minute. 85-pound wolf can eat nearly 20 pounds of food in one sitting. Wow. If you like to go to the steakhouse and get the king's portion, that's nothing compared to what a wolf can do in terms of consuming all of that food in a very, very short period of time. And what would you do after eating all that meat? Well, wolves do the same thing. They rest. And so and they rest quite a bit. At this point, we're starting to fill out a pretty good sense of what the life of a wolf is all about. They spend about 8 hours of every day walking. They spend about 8 hours of every day resting. and they spend about 8 hours of every day socializing with the members of their pack. And then about once a week, that pretty easygoing life, or so it seems, is punctuated by this remarkably dramatic, dangerous, brave, energy-exhausting event of having to capture their food, in the case of Isle Royale moose. And so that's, anyways, a little bit about what the kind of the nature of a wolf is all about, with one important exception that I want to talk about now. And that's, I mentioned that wolves walk a lot, and then I mentioned that they walk for a couple of reasons. One is to capture their food. The other reason that they walk so much is because they're territorial. And to be territorial means a couple of things. One is is that these wolves, they have not only a home range. A home range is just a place where the animal tends to hang out. But to be territorial means they defend that home range from, in this case, other wolves. And the reason that they do that is because you can think of a territory as kind of like being a refrigerator for the wolves. A refrigerator in the sense of it's where wolves store their food. A wolf pack's territory is generally just big enough to keep in it all of the food, all of the moose, in the case of Isle Royale, all the moose that's necessary to keep the pack going, to keep the adults fed, to keep the pups alive, to give enough energy to give birth to more pups, this sort of a thing. And there's this business of keeping a territory that's bigger than that it's too much work. It's a pretty dangerous business to defend all that territory, so it's generally as big as it needs to be. Now, territoriality is manifest through a series of behaviors, and one of the behaviors basically is this, is that when wolves are walking around the perimeter of their territory along the edge, about every couple hundred yards, they will scent mark, which means for one of the alphas, one of the leaders of the pack, a male or a female, to urinate on some conspicuous landmark. And in the wintertime, that landmark can be just something as simple as a snowbank. In the summertime, it might be a stump or a log or something like this. Now, in that urine are chemicals that other wolves can smell. They can smell it before they see it. They can smell it long after it's been deposited, as much as 2 weeks after it's been deposited. Wolves can still smell it. And basically what's happening is a message is being delivered. If you're a wolf that doesn't belong in this area, and you come upon the scent mark, the message being delivered is you don't belong here. And if you've come this far, it's in your interest to turn around and go back where you came from. And if you don't follow that idea, if you continue on into our territory, there could be pretty serious consequences for you. That's what the scent mark message is all about. And the consequences can be kind of a big deal. Wolves will kill one another over trespassing. And here I want to take a small digression just a little bit and talk about causes of death for wolves. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about it in some technical detail, but to give you a sense, in a place like Isle Royale, where humans are not involved in killing wolves, not either directly by shooting them or hitting them with cars or whatever, where the causes of death are for the most part natural. The two main causes of death are starvation, and then the other main cause of death are wolves killing one another. When wolves kill one another is because they're fighting over food. The other thing to know about the nature of wolves is the lifespan of a wolf. The longest that they can live is about 10 or 12 years. However, their life expectancy, the average duration of their life, is about 4 years. And remember what cuts their life short? The difficulty of getting food. Wolves typically only make it to about a third of their lifespan, and the main difficulty is getting food. And this runs at tremendous odds with what we know about, or with how we sometimes portray wolves as being gluttons, as being wasteful killers and that sort of thing. It is really a very poor portrayal of what the life of a wolf is all about. Nothing can be further than the truth than to think that a wolf is gluttonous. Their lives are very difficult when it comes to getting food. And this business that we've been talking about, wolves killing one another, fighting over food, and then just the business of starvation, that kind of demonstrates how their lives really are not gluttonous. Again, this is a topic we'll spend a little bit more time on, how it is that wolves consume their food and that sort of thing, in some upcoming lectures. But for now, we'll leave it at that. And so anyways, this is, in a nutshell, the nature of what the life of a wolf is all about. So we spend a little bit of time thinking about wolves, thinking about moose. And remember, I started off with just asking why would we care about moose, but we can now ask why would we care about wolves or moose. And I asked you to consider, well, maybe it's because these animals are well studied and they represent general insights about mammals, and that's maybe reason enough. Maybe it's because wolves and moose are important parts of ecosystems and we're interested in ecosystem health, and that's why we should study wolves and moose. Maybe it's because in places that I live, people hunt moose, and this is a very important part of the culture there. This is true throughout Canada, Alaska, Scandinavia, Siberia, the country of Russia. And it's important to understand the nature of wolves and moose for that reason. Okay, these are fine reasons. What I want to do is I want to give you some possible additional reasons to understand the nature of wolves. And I guess what I want to do is I want to actually just start off with this. One of the things that I find, frankly, it's a little bit disturbing for me sometimes, is that when I share with other people about the lives of wolves and moose, what they tell me is, wow, you study such a fascinating creature, wolves and moose, that's the coolest thing on the planet. And that bothers me a little bit, because while it is that wolves and moose are very, very interesting creatures, without a doubt, they're no more interesting than all the other creatures that are on the planet. And here's the thing. What made wolves and moose interesting here? Think about what it is that I did. I shared with you some pretty simple information. I said that moose chew their food a lot. I said that wolves walk a lot. We covered just some really simple things about wolves and moose, simple facts. But then what we did is we spent a lot of time imagining what it must be like to be a wolf or a moose. It's in that imaginative process, it's in that business of empathy that we began to realize, wow, what interesting creatures. And here's the thing. This is, if you like, in an informal sense, a homework assignment. Take a creature that lives near where you live, a creature that lives right outside your window. Could be a house sparrow. Could be a gray squirrel. Learn one or two things about it. We live in a day, in an age where we're drowning in information that's sometimes too much for us to really process and make sense of. Too much information sometimes to turn into knowledge. Here's the thing. Here's the assignment. Take take a creature, learn one or two things about it. Spend a lot of time imagining what it's like to be that robin that preys on the worm, how it is that they find it, how they deal with it at the end of the summer when there aren't so many worms around. How does the worm deal with it all? If you spend time imagining what it's like to be a worm and avoiding predation, I think you'll find out that those creatures are just as fascinating as wolves and moose are. Now, to add a little bit of, just to go a little bit further with this idea, what I want to do is share with you some ideas of some other scholars. First, Claude Levi-Strauss. He was an anthropologist. He studied indigenous people living in South America he did his work in the 1930s. In the 1960s, he was writing books about it. And one of the things that he was interested, especially how indigenous people in South America relate to the natural world around them. And one of the things that he said is that one may readily conclude that animals and plants are not known as a result of their usefulness. They're not known as a result of how they're useful to me because of what they do for ecosystem health, and I need good ecosystem health. Not useful to me in the sense of, I like to hunt this creature in order to hunt it better. I'd like to know more about it. No, instead, that they're deemed to be useful or interesting because they're first of all known. Okay, well, this is just a clue, just one idea. Now let's think of somebody else. Rachel Carson. Really one of the great heroes of environmental science of the 20th century. Somebody who's very, very brave and bold in terms of bringing together science and ethics all together at one step. She said that it's not so important to know as to feel. And feel, what we can take to mean in this case, is feeling means understanding from the perspective of that creature. We can think of it like that. And then a contemporary environmental philosopher, Kathleen Dean Moore, she once wrote in a journal called Environmental Ethics just a few years ago, she said that scientists who try to teach facts without feelings will not find their work transformed into the knowledge and wisdom that the times so urgently require. And so anyways, what I hope to have done is to have provided not only some conventional reasons for why it is that you'd want to understand the nature of wolves and moose, things like ecosystem health and how they contribute to that, and in so much as that wolves and moose may be a natural resource that we might want to manage and we might want to know about them like that, but also to understand wolves and moose on their own terms and to appreciate them for their own sake. Literally, if you like, the only way to care for something is to know something about it. And that may be the most important reason to learn about, well, any creature, really. And so, anyways, this ends our first lecture about the wolves and moose of Isle Royale. And we'll pick it up again with lecture number 2. Thank you so much. Bye now.